welcome. The United Nations reports that some 60 million people from Syria to Central America are currently uprooted from their homes, trying to escape violent conflicts and persecution. The report issued last week says the number of displaced people is unprecedented, a population as great as the United Kingdom, living in fear and unsettled. Today we'll try to grasp the human dimension of the crisis and look down the narrow road that leads to asylum in the USA. We'll devote the rest of the hour to some of the challenges immigrants face if they make it here to New York City. The language barrier. Critics say translation services are inadequate. The healthcare maze. A study shows many immigrant cab drivers are lost trying to get health insurance. We will also address the psychology of separation, including the consequences when some Chinese New Yorkers choose to send their babies back to China until school age. First, though, asylum and the uprooted. The exodus involves refugees around the globe. Most people fleeing conflict and persecution who head to the nearest border for relative safety, to Turkey from Syria, to Pakistan from Afghanistan, and so on. But in some cases, if these refugees can get to Germany or Russia or America, they can apply for asylum worldwide. Applications reached 1.4 million last year, the highest ever. The U.S. saw more than 120,000 asylum claims, up 44%, driven by crises in Mexico and Central America. Who is eligible for asylum? Is the door open wide enough or too wide? Joining us, Maria Blacque-Belair, founder of RIF, the Refugee and Immigrant Fund based in Astoria. It supports asylum seekers and helps them navigate the system. And via Skype from Cleveland, Nadeen Aljijakli, an attorney specializing in Syrian asylum cases. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Maria, tell us about your group and what kind of an increase in asylum applications you're seeing.
So RIF is really based to be an entry point, a welcome center, just to really initially orient and inform people of what it is what is the asylum process.
And what is it? What does asylum really mean? As
We're not a legal provider.
You're not a legal provider.
No, but we are that first step before, which is so much needed, because when people arrive here, they have no idea. I mean, they feel at first safe and relieved,
yes,
but they really don't know where to go, where to start.
So let me go right to Nadeen, because you are a lawyer, right? So you
Yes.
can explain what asylum is to people who are watching, have only casually heard the word. What is it in a legal sense?
Sure. So a person can only be eligible for asylum in the if they are here in the United States. They can only apply once they arrive in the country. And it offers protection to that person, and not just the ability to work in the United States and reside here lawfully, but it provides a path to remain here permanently, safe, without the fear of returning to their home country. So they can eventually gain a green card, and eventually there is a path for citizenship for that person.
Right. So why is it only if they're already here? You're saying, let's say somebody from Syria who's a refugee and they make it to the U.S. Embassy in Turkey, they can't apply for asylum in that way?
Exactly. So that's what's been the most difficult part of the procedures that are currently in place. If a person is in the United States, the process for asylum is very clear. They send in some paperwork. There's an interview that will be scheduled for them, and it's a much more predictable process.
And they have to prove that they're subject to political persecution and physical
Yes.
danger for political purposes in their home country?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. So the standard for asylum is very strict. Sometimes people assume that if you're from a war-torn country and even if terrible things have happened to you, there isn't a general notion that says just plain humanitarian asylum. It is very specific. The person has to show that they have a fear of returning to their home country based on what the U.S. immigration law calls a protected ground. One of those protected grounds is, as you mentioned, a political opinion. So they would be targeted due to their political opinion. Another protected ground is religion. So it has to be very specific, the reason that they could be targeted must be specific and tailored to that person. It's not enough to come from a country where the situation is terrible,
Right.
even with devastating circumstances.
So Maria, who is coming to your center in Astoria, and from what countries primarily in this case?
In our case, we have a majority of asylum seekers coming from Africa. I would say like about 60% come from Africa.
Which countries primarily?
Mostly Congo, Sudan, Guinea, Cameroon, Togo, Ivory Coast. Of course, it varies. We've been established since about 10 years, but mostly these countries. Then we have about 10% now. It has reduced from Latin America. For example, we used to have more people from Colombia, but there are less people now coming from Colombia. A few more from Venezuela, and the cases from Central America, mostly for domestic violence reason. Then the 10% from Asia and 10% from the Middle East.
You can get political asylum to escape domestic violence?
Yeah, in some circumstances you can.
Because the nation in question
it's
backs it up?
Quite a legal term, category, but it's belonging to a special category of people at risk. But the reason we were set up, as you can see, when someone has fled from their country, it's kind of overwhelming to just explain. I mean, not only to know what to do, but even to explain your story. To gather the information. Sometimes people don't have all the information. How do you have proof? So, at the beginning, there's really a need of a reassurance and supporting the asylum seekers. And then let alone trying to find, reputable and low-cost pro bono attorneys.
There are so many Syrian refugees now. Nadeen, I think many of our viewers are aware that that's the case, and they're fleeing to countries in the region. Are there many Syrian refugees coming to the United States, and are they coming to where you are in Cleveland, or what's the story?
Right. So the numbers have been extremely low. There's almost 4 million Syrian refugees. And until now, only about 700 or 800 have been admitted to the United States. So the
700 or
numbers
800.
are low. Mm-hmm. As I mentioned before, the process for people that have somehow made it here to apply for asylum is straightforward, but for them to come from abroad is nearly impossible, despite the situation on the ground and despite the vulnerable population and what they're facing.
How about Iraqis?
Many more Iraqis have been able to come. There's something specific happening with the Syrian population that they have not been admitting them. There's been a lot of talk that the administration is starting to expand that, but even what they've put forth so far has been that maybe by the end of 2015 we will have admitted 1,000 to 2,000, and those are the numbers that we're talking about, again, compared to the nearly 4 million refugees. For the people who have somehow made it here through some other means, not as a refugee, who somehow came to the United States, there's about a little over 4,000 that have applied for asylum.
Maria, you told us off the air on background about one of your folks from India originally. Do you want to tell that story as an example of an individual human being?
Yes, I mean, last week we got a call. I mean, someone who was really crying on the phone and saying, I came here. I haven't. He really literally said, my wife and he's actually a rare person who came with his wife and small child, and he said, my wife and my kid, we haven't eaten for 3 days, and I'm really at a loss. My wife said, look, you go in the city, you try to find some help, and if you don't, when you come back, we just take rat poison. I was like really in shock. So of course we met very quickly the next morning. He had actually gone to Catholic Charities to try to identify for a lawyer. Imagine he actually slept out. He came from New Jersey. He, of course, didn't have any place to stay because he wanted to be the first one. They told him, come, there's such a demand now for lawyers, and let's take Catholic Charities, that you have to arrive there by 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning and be at the door. So he said he slept outside, and he said, I put a paper, and this is a man who used to work on, cruise ships, who has, an MBA. But anyway, for religious persecution, he's here.
For religious
He
persecution.
had cigarette butts all over the place.
Burns.
Yes, burns, and he was totally, you could see he was at the end of his rope.
What religion is he that he was persecuted for being in India?
He told me he is a Christian.
It's that hard to be a Christian in India?
In his case, I think it was a mixture of religious and also being in some kind of political opposition. We didn't go through, to the extent because
Yes.
I said, okay, we helped him actually with the food, with trying to see another lawyer in case. He had waited about 6 hours to see a lawyer and was hoping to get a response today. But I was really glad that at the end we said, you're not going to do what you said, you're going to take rat poison. And
Good. You got a smile out of him.
yes, I think he did.
Well,
yeah,
good. I hope that case works out well. Do people also come because of sexual orientation?
Yes. We have quite, let's say, out of, for us, we have 60% that come because of political and religious persecution, but
Yes.
30% come because of sexual orientation persecution.
30%.
Particularly, of course, in Africa, it's a big issue.
Uh-huh.
And so I think now we're seeing an increasingly number of people from Africa for that reason. But when they come here, it's not so easy because the African community itself tend to be, let's say, quite homophobic, and so they have to hide. And they're afraid to say, to share. And so when they're trying to get that information on what to do, that's the extra challenge for them.
Nadeen, if people need to get here from Syria in order to get asylum in the United States, does your group help them do that? Are there ways that are the most common to get to the United States from Syria if this place is their goal?
Most of the Syrians that have somehow made it here have been fortunate enough to get visitor visas. So a lot of Syrians have just been able to apply through the normal route and be fortunate enough to get visitor visas. Most of them are being denied, but some were lucky enough. And this is why the numbers are so low. A visitor visa is not really the appropriate means for them to get here, because for a visitor visa you have to show that you're coming temporarily to the United States. And obviously someone who's leaving Syria, it's very difficult to show an intent that you're just coming here for a short visit and you don't intend to stay. But the problem is that there is no tangible refugee option for them, so they have nothing else that they can apply for. So they try to get a visitor visa. We've seen a lot of Syrian students come here on F1 student visas. That's another popular option, and others who have been able to come on work or research visas and that sort of thing, but very few that have come as refugees.
Do you personally have any relatives or other loved ones back in Syria who can't get here or can't get asylum here, even with your expertise?
Yes, absolutely, and that's very difficult as an immigration attorney. I am Syrian American. I have many family members on the ground in Syria, and they have attempted to apply for visitor visas and been denied repeatedly, and that just shows the difficulty, and they can't understand, with such a desperate situation, not just why I can't help them, but how the U.S. is not able to open that door to them.
And there are something like 10,000 people here on visitor visas. Do I have that number right?
Yes, approximately. The U.S. also offered another option for Syrians that are here called temporary protected status, which was really a wonderful thing that allows Syrians, again, those that were fortunate enough to make it here, to remain here, even if they don't apply for asylum. And temporary protected status has nothing to do with politics. They just have to show that they're here. And very few countries are designated for temporary protected status, so it allows them to live here and work here.
I gather a political problem in getting asylum for some Syrians in this country is if they have donated in the past to the Free Syrian Army, one of the rebel groups trying to fight Assad, but it has a bad reputation as a terrorist group in Washington, right?
Correct. So there's portions, extremist factions of the opposition that the U.S. has designated as a terrorist group. But unfortunately, what we see happening as advocates is some vulnerable populations who really need the most protection are being thrown into this category when they really have no connection to the Free Syrian Army or any of that. They've merely been protesting the government, and they've been questioned about their ties, which can cause delays in the process and which can also cause a denial of their case.
Is the U.S. aiding the Free Syrian Army at this point?
There was some licensing and things like that allowed some groups to operate here that are giving aid to them, and it's very specific. So it's interesting that the U.S. is able to assist in some ways, but then if for purposes of asylum, it could actually hurt an applicant.
Right.
There is a conflict there.
And Maria, just in our last 30 seconds, New York is an immigrant town.
Yes.
Mayor de Blasio is a pro-immigrant mayor. We know the city ID cards and things like that, which are intended to help undocumented immigrants and many things. Why is your group needed? Does the city not provide the immigrant services and potential asylum seeker services that you would think they might?
I think that the city or the U.S. government has decided that the assistance they will provide is once people have been granted asylum. So basically, once they arrive here and they apply for asylum, they are on their own. They have to figure out how to do it. And then once they get asylum, then they get some assistance. So that's where we come in and try to help during that period.
As a private group. Well, thank you both very much for joining us.
Yes,
Good luck to you.
thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Good luck, Nadeem.
Half the students in the New York City school system speak with their parents in a language other than English. But when many of those parents meet with teachers or staff at the schools, there's inadequate translation provided, despite Department of Education regulations. This was the finding of a report by the New York Immigration Coalition, an independent advocacy group comprised of more than 200 member organizations. Our next guest takes on this and many other issues concerning the city's immigrant community, which is more than a third of the population here. Joining us is Stephen Choi, Executive Director of the New York Immigration Coalition. Welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
What are the Education Department regulations on translation for parent-teacher conferences?
So the department's regulations basically state that parent outreach needs to be performed in a number of different languages, not only the top 6 languages that are spoken, but really several more. And I think the regulations are good. The problem is the implementation is not there. And so the reality that we're seeing on the ground is that parents aren't getting translation and teachers aren't able to get translation resources as well. So we have a situation where schools, teachers, and parents all are not able to talk to each other regarding the future of their kids, something very critical.
How is it supposed to work? Is a principal supposed to identify the language groups within the school and get translators from the Central Education Department, or how is it supposed to work?
So there's supposed to be translators. There's supposed to be active use of a language line, which you can call in and have a telephonic interpreter. You can also supposed to have report cards that are translated into different languages. Unfortunately, we're not seeing widespread use of any of these. One of the things that Chancellor Farina has really said is that let's take a district-wide approach to looking at our students. Well, for each district, there should be a language access coordinator who says, here are the resources that are available for schools, teachers, and parents, and here's how you can access them. That's not being done.
Are translation services better in other city functions? I know the activist group Make the Road, for example, is big in this area, and they've won better translation services for emergency rooms and some other things. So is the education department lagging behind?
I would say so. We've worked closely with Make the Road. We've worked closely with a lot of other organizations, to make sure that not only has there been proper language access in the healthcare context, but also citywide and statewide. There's a citywide executive order, there's a statewide executive order, and there's a federal law, the Civil Rights Act. There's a case that went up to the Supreme Court that was exactly about this issue, about translation for parents and students in San Francisco's Chinatown, in that example. So this is really the heart of language access, and I do think the Department of Education needs to do more to provide these resources for parents. You just are not able to keep parents in the dark.
How so? And is Chancellor Farina resistant or sympathetic and just hasn't gotten the I's dotted and the T's crossed on the policy?
I think Chancellor Farina has said that parent engagement is a real priority for her. I think that this is, it's obviously a very large department that has a lot of moving parts. This has to be a system-wide priority. This has to be something where they really think about how are they going to approach language access on every single thing that they do. The department currently has a translation interpretation unit that is supposed to really be thinking about all the resources. There are 2 people who work at that translation interpretation unit. That's not enough for this particular system. We need to do more to make sure that report cards are translated, that if a kid is being bullied in their class, that their parent knows exactly how to convey this to their teacher and the principal.
Now, I see another of your issues is that Mayor de Blasio's proposed budget has less money for adult language education. The final details of that budget are emerging over the last couple of days. Have you seen how it came out for that?
We have not seen how it's come out fully. What's at stake is nearly $5 million, about $4.75 million, for the seats of 4,100 students who are in these adult education classes. So 4,100 students, their seats are really literally hanging on the brink here, depending on what happens with the city budget. Now, this mayor, I think we can be clear that it has been the most progressive mayor the most progressive mayor in a while, and also the most progressive mayor on immigration for a while. So it's surprising that we don't have an agreement to really preserve these 4,100 seats. Make no mistake, adult education is critical for immigrants. Whether you're taking an ESL class, whether you're trying to get certified, these are absolutely critical for so many of the strivers that are immigrants here in New York. It would be a real shock and horror to see that 4,100 students didn't have their seat as of July 1st. We have less than 10 hours, and so we'll have to see what final agreements are made.
Start of the year, municipal IDs were rolled out. And the point of that, for people who don't know, is so that every New Yorker, regardless of your immigration status, can have a legal government-issued photo ID, right? How's it working?
I think the mayor needs to get a tremendous share of credit for really rolling out what is the biggest, the best, and most successful municipal ID program in the entire country. We have seen a tremendous response from not only the immigrant community, from non-immigrants as well, to make sure that everybody has their municipal ID. I have mine, my wife has mine, my mother-in-law has her ID. And I think that the mayor has not gotten his full share of credit. I think there was a narrative at the beginning of the rollout that talked about a comparison to Obamacare and said, this was bungled. It wasn't bungled. There was a tremendous demand that I don't think anybody anticipated. He needs to get credit for making sure not only that it's in the hands of tens of thousands of people, but also that a lot of non-immigrants are doing, which is actually the best thing for immigrants.
Is it, in a way, a political act for non-immigrants or even non-undocumented immigrants to go ahead and get municipal IDs? Because if it's kind of very widespread, if a lot of people have them, then you don't automatically get tagged as an undocumented by showing a municipal ID.
That's absolutely right. And that was one of our central recommendations to the administration. Make sure that you have the benefits that are available so that non-immigrants are going to take it, because otherwise, you're right, it does become a scarlet letter, as it has in other cities. So it's absolutely critical to make sure a lot of non-immigrants take advantage, and they've done a stellar job in lining up all the partnerships and benefits to do that.
What are some of those advantages that non-immigrants can get by having a municipal ID?
Yeah, so some of the benefits, the ones that I'm most aware of because I have a family and kids, you can get free membership, for example, to the Queen's Botanical Garden. I went there this past weekend. You can get a free membership admission to the zoo in Central Park. You can get discounts to the Brooklyn Museum. You can get discounts to grocery stores, a 5% discount at Food Bazaar, where my wife happens to like to shop. So these are really critical, and I think they've done a stellar job, and I think it's been great to say that this is something for all New Yorkers, regardless of undocumented immigrant status, and to be able to make that statement to say that we as a city welcome everybody together and we're not going to make those divisions based on status. That's absolutely important.
How hard is it to get a municipal ID?
It's much easier than it used to be. When I got my municipal ID, I was able to sign up for an appointment a couple weeks in advance. I went in that day. I waited 15, 20 minutes, and then they mailed that ID to me several weeks later. So I think the narrative that you have to wait months and months and this has been bungled and all these kinds of errors have happened, that's not true.
Photo ID, right? So you have to go in person and get your head snapped.
Yes. You have to go in and prove your identity. You've got to prove your residence. And I think that there has been a lot of work put in to say, how can we make this available for folks who may not necessarily have easy access to a photo ID? I think they've done a very good job around that, and I think they've built in protections on the back end. One of the critical concerns for a lot of civil liberties and immigrant groups has been, what happens when ICE wants to get that information? What happens if at some point a president or an immigration enforcement authority wants to take the info and find those people? They've done a really good job on those protections. I'm pretty confident that that information is secure.
Next issue, fraud. There are all kinds of schemers out there trying to prey on vulnerable immigrants, correct?
Yes, there is. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard that are really heartbreaking. You're talking about people who have given hundreds, in some cases thousands of dollars to people who say they are notarios, to people who say that they are some sort of immigration provider, to real immigration lawyers who haven't followed up. I think the worst thing that we've seen, though, is not necessarily the loss of money. It's the fact that if you file a fraudulent application, or if your application somehow is wrong, you may be on the path to deportation as a result. And we've seen some very tragic examples of that. So one of the things that we've been doing, we were able to work with the state and Governor Cuomo's folks last year to pass a bill that would target immigrant fraudulent providers, and also to establish, essentially to punish the bad guys and also to support the good guys. And that's given some new tools to law enforcement. I think that's been successful, but we still have a long way to go.
Now, President Obama tried to make it easier for various groups of undocumented people to stay here, the so-called dreamers, the young adults or children brought here by their parents when they were little, so they really grew up as Americans, even though technically they're undocumented immigrants. And then he tried to do the same for millions of the parents of those particular so-called dreamer kids or young adults. That's where the court stepped in and said, no, you can't. What's the status of that?
The status of that is that it's in a federal appeals court right now. The unfortunate thing is that there was a lawsuit filed by, let's face it, 25 states and attorney generals who thought that there was a political road to be hoed there. And I think they found the most anti-immigrant judge in the federal system, and they went down to Brownsville, Texas, and they filed a lawsuit there. And they've gummed up the works for the past 6 months. I think at the end of the day, and our legal allies say this, that we will prevail. The problem is the clock is running out. And I think that President Obama did the right thing in stepping forward and saying, Congress is not going to act, I'm going to act. But we're running out of time for his presidency. And I think at some point, advocates, we need to say, look, we need to gear up. In some ways, what we thought was a victory was not a victory. And what is next? We've got to be looking at all the different candidates that are going to be in office about a year and a half from now.
And obviously that's going to be a big issue in the 2016 race, regardless of who the candidates turn out to be.
Yes.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. A recent study surveyed New York City taxi drivers, a group largely made up of immigrants, on their knowledge of their options under the Affordable Care Act. The study, New York City Taxi Drivers' Knowledge and Perceptions of the Affordable Care Act, was published recently in the Journal of Community Health. To discuss, lead author Francesca Gainey, Chief of Immigrant Health and Cancer Disparities at the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Welcome.
Thank you.
What was your study design?
The study design was a pre-post study where we surveyed taxi drivers about their knowledge of the Affordable Care Act before we did an intervention, which was a mobile educational intervention that addressed taxi drivers' knowledge gaps and told them all about the Affordable Care Act, what they were entitled to under that, what the insurance would help them to access in terms of health care. And then after the intervention, we surveyed them again to find out how their knowledge had changed about the Affordable Care Act.
Why, of all the people in the world, taxi drivers?
Well, taxi drivers, there are many reasons. Taxi drivers, first of all, are at great health risk. They're driving all day. It's a very sedentary occupation. They are at risk for cardiovascular disease. They're exposed to particulate matter, to air pollution, so they have an increased lung cancer risk. They eat bad food when they're on the road. They work long hours, which makes it really hard for them to access the healthcare system, which is generally open 9 to 5, 9 to 7. And many of them, we had learned earlier in our work, are uninsured. We work with taxi drivers because it's a very large population of immigrants. In New York City, over 100,000 people are taxi drivers. Half of them are yellow cab drivers, and the rest dispersed through Green, Uber, and other livery drivers. And given that we found that they had poor health outcomes and poor access to care, we really wanted to focus on this group.
How many have insurance?
So it's anywhere, depending on which group you're looking at, anywhere between 50% to 60%, up to 70% for livery drivers.
Why would the livery drivers have the most?
So livery drivers make a little bit more money, and that gives them a little bit more more options in terms of getting health insurance. Also, livery drivers are disproportionately from different areas of the world than yellow cab drivers, and it might be something having to do with that as well.
And so is the Affordable Care Act making a difference for taxi drivers?
It's making somewhat of a difference, but probably not right now enough of a difference. And that's part of the work that we're doing, is to really get out there in the community and to do more education, and also to help actually sign people up for the Affordable Care Act. Because part of our work, we're navigators for through the state funding in order to actually sign people up for health insurance.
How big was the language barrier, since so many taxi drivers are immigrants?
Well, in this particular study, actually, many of the drivers had limited English proficiency. So only 32% of the drivers had full English proficiency. And so in this group, the language barrier seems to have been a barrier for the drivers. But that was just this small sample that we worked with. And it was a skewed sample because we really targeted the drivers who didn't have insurance.
And what other reasons were there that awareness of the Affordable Care Act was as low as it was?
Well, many drivers are on the road all the time. They don't have that much access to some of the messaging that's coming out about the Affordable Care Act. And that's part of the reason why this intervention goes to where the drivers are. It goes to taxi garages. It goes to religious institutions that they frequent. It goes to where the drivers are, because otherwise they're not having that much access. Information went out on the radio for them. So that's a big part of it.
So are there optimal ways of delivering information about the Affordable Care Act to taxi drivers?
I think there are. I think part of it is this mobile workshop, which we take on the road just like the taxi drivers take their taxis on the road, and really going to where taxi drivers are, change of shift at garages, delivering the message in the many languages that drivers speak. The vast majority of yellow cab drivers are from South Asia, so we had Punjabi workshops. We had workshops in Hindi. So doing it in the language of the drivers, where they are, at times that they had time available to listen, such as change of shift, really important. And then enabling them to sign up for health care when we deliver the message is also really important for health care insurance.
Are the fleet owners not doing everything that they could, to the extent that there's still a system where people, take out a yellow cab for the day and start from a base and bring it back to a base? Is Affordable Care Act information being disseminated there, and should it be more?
Well, the taxi drivers are independent contractors, so they all have to get insurance on their own. In terms of the fleet owners and disseminating information, it's varied. Some of the fleet owners are very cooperative and were really eager to have us come and do the presentations, and also are very eager to have us go to the garages and do health fairs and screenings and to really hook these guys up with care and navigate them into care. And some aren't so eager. And some garages don't have the space, so it's pretty mixed.
How about the new Uber taxi economy, which seems to be the rising force? Good or bad for health insurance?
Well, it depends, again, on how much somebody's driving, how much money they're making, and how affordable the insurance is for them. One of the barriers for the drivers was the cost of insurance under the Affordable Care Act. So some of the drivers did a calculus and decided they'd rather pay the fine than have to pay the health insurance premiums, because it would make just too much of a dent in their take-home.
Did you say that some drivers thought they had health insurance when they didn't actually?
Yes, that was in the paper, that some of the drivers were under the impression they had health insurance because of that surcharge that had been levied last year, in which they were paying 6 cents on a fare into the Health and Disability Fund. And many of them assumed that that meant that they were paying into a fund that was giving them health insurance. In fact, they would take out their stubs from the garages and show us how they paid into that stub. And then we had to let them know that, yes, they were paying that, but unfortunately, that wasn't paying for health insurance.
So you've got a private outreach effort. Is there anything that you've learned from your studies that could help the government reach more people, taxi drivers and maybe even others? Because, of course, the goal of the Obama administration is for as many people as possible to be insured, to reach, as close to full insurance as we can.
Absolutely. And we've got a private effort, but it is funded by New York State dollars, our navigating folks into the health insurance. Absolutely. If they going to occupational structures and really working within occupational structures is a great way to reach large numbers of people who are uninsured, especially independent contractors who have to get their own health insurance. So for the taxi industry, for example, the TLC, which sends out notices to the drivers, the Taxi and Limousine Commission, could use that same mechanism to do a blast of information about Affordable Care Act, health insurance, signing up for health insurance, healthy living messages, just a message to get up out of your taxi every hour and take a walk around the taxi. So that could certainly be used. Also, the fleet owners could be doing the same thing when they message, although that is a private system. So those things could all have a lot of impact. The holding lots at the airports, fabulous place to disseminate information, and we've done some work there because it's such a window of opportunity. So they could use that structure also to be doing education, screenings, navigation, and real health interventions there.
Undocumented immigrants are not eligible for Affordable Care Act policies. Did you try to avoid the undocumenteds among the drivers, or what was your relationship to that?
Absolutely not. We embrace the undocumented immigrants, and we make a special effort to reach them because they are underserved and more marginalized. And we're really lucky to be in New York City, where there are so many options for health care, even for those who are uninsured. So we really take each individual person, figure out what they're eligible for, what they're not, and then get them to the kind of health care that they can afford. We find services that are available when they're off duty so that the time isn't an issue, and really help hook them up with care.
So do you have follow-up research in the offing?
Absolutely. We are currently conducting a randomized controlled trial that's funded by the National Institutes of Health that's looking at 3 different models for bringing taxi drivers into the healthcare system. And it's randomized at the level of the taxi garage. So we're working with 30 taxi garages, 10 in each arm of this study. One arm is our usual health fair model where we screen folks and then we navigate them into healthcare. The second is an arm in which we're using mobile health technology, text messaging when they're off duty, et cetera, to help get them into care. And coupled with that arm is a really exciting development, which is peer taxi coaches. So we have a group of community members, taxi drivers, who we've trained to be peer coaches and navigators who are going to use their social networks to get people into healthcare.
And why is this a Sloan Kettering function? People think of Sloan Kettering as the place where you go for really sophisticated cancer treatment. Why this?
So Sloan Kettering is also really interested in prevention. And this is a really important effort in terms of prevention. We know drivers are at risk for shared cardiovascular disease and cancer risk factors. And Memorial Sloan Kettering does prevention also in terms of cancer. And so this is part of their community engaged programming and their cancer prevention.
Well, thank you for sharing your research with us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Up next, satellite babies, the after effects when Chinese New Yorkers send their infants home to grandparents, then bring them back at school age. For new immigrants, raising a family in New York City can be especially difficult, expensive, crowded, culturally challenging. Some Chinese American families address this by sending their babies back to China to be raised by relatives. They bring them back here when they reach school age, sometimes later. But these children are known as satellite babies, and they may develop problems, especially as teenagers. Over the past 2 years, Brooklyn's Chinatown district has seen an uptick in teens running away from home. Our guests see a link. What are the effects on these children raised in 2 vastly different worlds? Joining us, psychiatrist Jackie Chen. Dr. Chen is the founder of the nonprofit Chinese American Sunshine House, which provides culturally sensitive care to new immigrants in Brooklyn. And with us as well, Sinovision producer and reporter Fang Choi. The story where we first learned about satellite babies was produced by her and 3 other reporters who recently won an IPPY Award, that is first prize in multimedia, from the Center for Community and Ethnic Media, an initiative of the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Fang, tell us first, why was your report focused on Brooklyn rather than what many people may think of as the epicenter of Chinese population in New York, Flushing?
Overall, Brooklyn has seen more Chinese new immigrants than Flushing. So
from certain parts of China concentrating?
Exactly. So Brooklyn has more Chinese immigrants from Fujian province. That's the southeast of China. And it's more common for people from there to send their babies back to China to be raised by grandparents.
Why? Is it primarily economic or also other reasons?
I would say primarily because both parents have to make a living. They work long hours, so they cannot take care of their children. But they also see benefits in sending their babies back to China to be raised by grandparents. First of all, they can bond with grandparents, learn Chinese culture, learn the language. Second of all, in China, it's very common for grandparents to take care of grandchildren while parents work.
Dr. Chen, why would this be a problem from a psychiatrist's point of view?
Well, I think we need to take a look at cultural aspect. Fang mentioned that there is some financial hardship for these parents. They work long hours in the restaurant with a minimal wage. Culturally, I think somehow Chinese people think the grandparents are still the best caretakers. And number 2, they think it's very common that old generation, they stay back behind, but the younger generation, they venture out and establish their life in America. Number three, I think it is a mistaken belief that those young children, if they send back, they will more adapt to new environment.
Yes.
So I think with this cultural aspect, so more and more young couples, especially in this subgroup of Fujianese, they come from Fujian province, they send their children to China. I think a satellite baby is not limited to Chinese population. It also among Africans or Caribbeans. But I think among Chinese population, Fujianese are the most doing this as a subgroup.
And so what's the marker for success versus failure? Is it primarily whether you bring them back early enough for them to learn the language like a native, like by age 4 or something like that? Is that like the biggest thing?
Yeah, that's expectation. You learn a new language, you have all the Chinese language, also you learn math at early age in China. So parents hope they can have a solid foundation when they go to school. They think they can pick up English very quickly once they start school here because everybody else speaks English. But the problem is, first of all, it's not that easy for every kid to learn language, to adapt to new culture. Second of all, living away from their parents sometimes give them psychologically some shadow in their development. They are detached from adults, from their parents. It's hard for them to establish friendship with their classmates because all their good friends, they think, are still back in China.
Yes, and a certain kind of attachment that takes place between babies and parents universally is broken if they're sent back as infants?
Absolutely. I think if we take a look from psychiatric aspect, these children they have a disruption of attachment of their family members. And that will bring a lifelong consequence. And we do see a lot of these kids, they suffering development delay. We have a higher rate of depression, not only for those children when they come back, even with their parents. They have tremendous guilt and remorse, as well as a lot of other dysfunction, like a dysfunction in family. And also those kids somehow prone to developmental delay, anxiety, separation anxiety. So that is really a lot of, I would say, it's a lifelong sequence with a lot of dysfunctions.
I want to show a video in a minute of public school officials in New York trying to help parents to deal with their teenagers from the Sino-Vision piece, of course, that's the video. But before we even do that, it sounds from the answer that you just gave that this is such a serious problem, the attachment issue. Do you recommend that nobody send their babies back as satellite babies, that this practice just cease?
As a psychiatrist, I would say I would strongly object this idea for satellite baby. But the reality is different. However, as a psychiatrist, I also want to say if that happens, what we can do when the satellite baby return to reunite with their parents, what we can do. I was thinking that we can really do assessment, screen them for any disorder or underlying disorder. We also should help these parents to rebuild the attachment with their children. They should learn a lot of things, like communication therapy. They need to learn communication skill. They want to help them to bridge the connection between them. There's a lot of other problems with these children, the language issues, teenage rebellions. And also, worst thing is when they come back, sometimes the separation continues because those parents, they still work long hours in other state, for example, and they come back living with the relatives or with the grandparents again. So it's really prolonging.
Let's see an excerpt from Fong's Sino-Vision piece in which we'll see parents talking to kids. This is a clip of a public school counselor with some advice on talking to your kids and taking advantage of public school resources.
作为家长，最重要的是不要跟孩子发生很大的冲突，在气头上的话是不能讲的。比如说，孩子如果说我干脆就走了，你们不要不要理我了。我有一次问一些孩子，我说你们父母跟你们哪一句话是最伤你们的心的？小孩子一致都同意，就是说父母说我来了美国都是为了你们。这个时候呢，家长一定要看看这个情况是不是真的很严重。如果孩子真的是这样讲呢，你下面一句话就不能说你愿意上哪就上哪吧，你滚吧。这句话一说下去，后果是非常不好的。那在这个时候，家长可以说看得出来你很不开心哈，你很想离开这个家，但是可不可以告诉我为什么？在这个时候是非常重要，一句话就可以改变一个孩子的一生的。那作为家长呢，也应该在这个时候寻求老师的帮助和学校的合作。学校里头有很多资源可以利用的，他们有免费的心理辅导，而且家庭医生也是很重要。可以跟孩子的小儿科医生表达这些问题，然后小儿科医生会介绍你们寻找合适的心理医生。这个时候如果给孩子一点帮助呢，你会看到有很好的转机。
Public school counselor Xiaoxing Feng, so heartbreaking. If people were able to follow the subtitles, I mean, she's talking about teenagers who want to leave home, and is it right for the parents to say, even sympathetically, I understand you want to leave home, you can leave home, that they're going to feel unloved if the parents do that. Such difficult, complicated, heartbreaking situations.
Yeah, I know a few kids who run away from home. When we interviewed them, we asked, why do you leave home? Why do you decide to stay outside, not coming home? They said, I cannot stand my parents nagging. They always, pick on me. They feel like they are not loved. So especially the kids, get into a fight with their parents. Their parents order them to do things, not like, let's talk about it, how we should do it. They just order, you have to finish your homework, you have to get 100% on your English test. So the kids didn't get help. They feel their parents have high expectations of them. They cannot meet that expectation. So for them, they feel frustrated at home, at school, and they feel not loved at home. The only thing for them to do is run away to hang out with kids in similar situations.
Is this a cultural difference between China and the United States, or is this more of a universal parent-teenager issue?
I think it's culturally. I would still say it's culturally different, absolutely, in China as in USA. However, we should understand those generations. They are, they came here in their 20s or 30s. They become young parents. They have their dreams. So sometimes a lot of them, they displace their dreams to their children. They think the children should fulfill their dreams to fulfill their expectations. But I think I want to bring is the satellite baby, because the bonding and attachment is disrupted. So whenever the children is really see parents are their parents, they don't feel loved. And when they come to this country, they kind of traumatized. In an article, also a psychologist wrote an article, as if they stolen by a strangers to a strange land and living with their parents after these 3 years separation. So that creates a lot of problems. And meanwhile, those parents, they really displace their expectation to their children. They will say, look, I work so hard, 10 hours a day, 7 days, it's for you.
Is that the most hurtful thing a child can hear?
I will say it's very, the child they have their own problems, so it is very hurtful, I think, in a way. They also this give these children a lot of pressure. So children maybe think, well, they give up. What's the way to give up? Wrong way.
So do you come to any conclusions in the documentary about what parents should do, either with respect to satellite babies and not sending their babies back as satellite babies, or how to communicate with teenagers?
For Chinese parents, it's very hard to think psychologically because, they work so hard just to make a living. They thought, I sacrificed so much. The rest is up to you. You have to do your best. You have to excel at school. You have to succeed. Hopefully you'll be a professional, become a lawyer or doctor in the future. That's all the sacrifice I make for you to have a better future. So after doing this story, I feel like my message to the parents is, first of all, when you send your kids back to China to be raised grandparents, maybe you should do parenting remotely. See what you can do.
To maintain the connection.
To maintain the connection, not just send money back so they can get food or clothes. And secondly, you have to rethink your priority. I know it's hard to make a living, but is it worth to have a kid who run away, who gets into trouble in the future? So that's my message to the parents.
It's so sad when something that parents do because they think it's in the best interest of the child, and something as family-oriented as sending a child to the grandparents, they think it's an act of love and an act of support, and yet it sounds like psychologically it often backfires. So just tell our viewers finally a little bit about Sunshine House.
Sunshine House is a nonprofit organization. I founded 3 years ago. It is in the center, the location is in the center of Brooklyn, where it has the rapidly Chinese growing populations. Sunshine House is really aims to advocate mental health. We provide lectures, we provide educations, and also workshops. We wanted to advocate people, teenagers, adults, about mental health, stigma, trying to delete their stigma of mental health, encourage them to get treatment, and encourage them to have a quality life in a very healthy mental environment, not just working.
Good goals. And with so many immigrant populations in New York, we need culturally sensitive mental health care of all kinds. So it's good that you're providing it for the Chinese community in Brooklyn, as you are. Thank you very much, and thank you for your journalism.
Thank you for having us.
And that's our special hour on asylum and immigration. We're here each week at this hour. Next time, Smart Guns, Scared Healthy, the effective ad campaign against smoking and obesity, plus the folk music of the civil rights movement. And tune in to my radio program weekdays on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.